Welcome, everyone. Today, we're doing a deep dive into Friedrich A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom.
Oh, a classic.
It really is. Published in 1944, right in the middle of World War II. It's a powerful critique of collectivist ideologies.
And surprisingly relevant even today.
Exactly. We'll also be looking at some commentary from other thinkers of the time, people like Max Eastman, Peter Drucker. You might be surprised how much their insights on planned economies, and even the erosion of truth, how much those resonate, even now.
It's fascinating how Hayek wasn't just theorizing, right? He was living through it. I mean, seeing totalitarian regimes rise in Europe.
Yep.
He witnessed firsthand the dangers of what he called the allure of the great utopia. That seductive promise of a better world, but a very different destination in reality.
Yeah, and he doesn't just point fingers at dictators or anything. He really unpacks how this road to serfdom, as he calls it, how it starts with seemingly good intentions.
Right.
Like, for example, he talks about how early socialists really pushed this idea of freedom from necessity being a higher form of freedom.
Yeah.
But doesn't that open the door to some really tricky questions? I mean, who gets to decide what those necessities even are?
Right.
And then what happens to individual choice when a central authority decides what you need to be truly free?
Yeah, that's the core of Hayek's argument, isn't it?
Yeah.
He contrasts this freedom from necessity idea with that more, I guess, traditional definition of freedom, like freedom from coercion. And he argues that while, the freedom from necessity thing might sound nice on the surface,
Yeah.
it ultimately leads to this, a situation where the individual is subservient to the collective will, basically. It's the collective, usually represented by the state, that gets to decide what you need, what you get, and ultimately what you're even allowed to do.
That's a pretty stark contrast, right, to the kind of individual liberty that we often associate with democracy.
Right.
It makes you wonder how those two ideas can coexist. I mean, democracy and socialism, because they both kind of emphasize equality, don't they?
They do. That's where things get interesting, right? Hayek, along with other thinkers like Alexis de Tocqueville,
Yeah.
they argue that while both democracy and socialism use the word equality, they mean very different things.
No. Yeah.
Democracy is about equality in terms of liberty, making sure everyone has those same fundamental rights and freedoms.
Right.
Socialism, on the other hand, it's about equality in, restraint and servitude in a way, meaning that everyone is equally subject to the dictates of the state.
So it's not just about like material equality or something. It's about who holds the power to actually make decisions about your life.
Exactly.
And Hayek saw this play out in both Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. Kind of strange to lump those two together,
Yeah,
right?
it does seem that way.
But he was struck by how both regimes, despite their, I guess, superficial differences, they ended up suppressing individual liberties.
Yeah.
And he argues that this kind of convergence on authoritarianism, that it wasn't just a coincidence.
Oh, interesting.
It was a consequence of the collectivist ideologies that they both embrace, even though those ideologies were often presented as, polar opposites.
Right. Hayek and a lot of the other sources we're looking at, they challenge that common assumption that communism and fascism are at opposite ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
They argue that in practice, both ideologies, they share this kind of disturbing tendency towards authoritarianism.
It's like they're different roads, but leading to the same destination.
Exactly.
Or the society where the individual is ultimately subordinate to the state.
Right, and where freedom is sacrificed in the name of some, greater good.
Greater good, yeah.
It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it that many prominent Nazi and fascist leaders, they actually started out as socialists.
Really?
Yeah, this really highlights Hayek's point about the slippery slope to totalitarianism. You might start out with these noble goals,
Right.
but the means that you use to achieve those goals can lead you down a very different path than you intended. Absolutely. And this leads us right into Hayek's core argument, right? The inherent conflict that exists between central planning and democratic principles. He argues that even when planners are democratically elected,
Yeah.
they still face this impossible task.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you create a single unified plan that's going to somehow satisfy the incredibly diverse and often conflicting needs of an entire society?
But wouldn't a well-intentioned planner, wouldn't they just prioritize the needs of the people? Isn't that the goal of a planned economy?
In theory, sure. But Hayek argues it's not that simple.
Okay.
He points out that even if a planner genuinely wants to do what's best for everyone, right?
Right.
They're still operating with limited knowledge.
Yeah.
No single mind, no matter how brilliant,
Right.
can possibly grasp all those individual needs and desires, all the preferences that exist within a complex society.
Yeah.
And that's really where the problems start.
So it's not just about bad intentions, it's about the inherent limitations of central planning, even with the best of intentions. But how does this actually play out? I mean, what happens when the plan inevitably clashes with reality?
That's when things get really interesting. Hayek argues that in a centrally planned system, democratic institutions, things like parliaments, they become increasingly ineffective. They're tasked with this impossible job, producing agreement on every little detail of the plan.
Oh, wow.
And that leads to endless debates, gridlock.
It's easy to see how that would lead to people getting frustrated.
Oh, absolutely.
And disillusioned with the democratic process itself.
Yeah.
And if the system's not working,
Right.
people might start looking for other solutions, even if those solutions come at the cost of freedom.
Exactly. And that's the danger. When people lose faith in those democratic institutions, they become more susceptible to those authoritarian leaders who come in and promise, quick and decisive action.
Right, right.
They're willing to trade their freedom for that illusion of security and stability.
So you start out with this utopian vision of a planned society, but the very act of planning, the attempt to control, to predict every aspect of human behavior, it leads you down this path towards authoritarianism. It's a chilling irony.
It is. And Hayek doesn't stop there. He goes on to explore how this central planning can actually undermine the very foundation of truth itself.
Wait, what? How can planning affect something as fundamental as truth?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it leads us into some even darker territory.
Okay.
Hayek argues that totalitarian regimes, by their very nature, they need to control information.
Right.
And so they start to manipulate language, like literally changing the meanings of words, words like freedom and justice to fit their agenda.
It's like that anecdote, where those two brothers end up speaking different languages.
Yeah.
After one of them embraces the totalitarian ideology, they can't even understand each other anymore.
That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
And Hayek argues that in a planned system, every piece of information, even things that seem like apolitical facts, they become subject to distortion, to maintain that illusion that the plan is infallible. Dissent becomes dangerous, criticism is stifled, and any independent thought that's seen as a threat to the state.
It's actually chilling when you look at some of the examples from the source material.
Yeah.
Things like that official condemnation of chess for the sake of chess in Russia.
Really?
Yeah. Or the concept of a party line in mathematics. It's hard to believe that even something as seemingly objective as math could be, subjected to this ideological control.
Right.
But these examples, they show just how pervasive that control can become in a totalitarian system. It's like the very fabric of reality is being manipulated to fit the plan.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings up a crucial question. What happens to a society when truth itself becomes, a casualty of the plan?
Yeah.
How can people make informed decisions or even hold their leaders accountable when the information they're getting is distorted or suppressed?
That's definitely something we'll need to explore further. But I think it's safe to say that Hayek saw a really deep and dangerous connection between the allure of security and that erosion of freedom. He understood that people crave security, especially in times of crisis.
Of course.
But he warned that seeking that absolute security at the expense of freedom could actually lead to the loss of both.
Exactly. And that's a good place to stop for now. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how Hayek distinguishes between different types of security and how the pursuit of a particular kind of security, that security of a guaranteed income or standard of living, how that can lead to greater insecurity and instability for society as a whole.
This is where things get really interesting. It forces us to confront maybe some uncomfortable truths about our own desires for security, for stability.
It does.
And it raises some really challenging questions about the role of the state, in providing for its citizens.
It certainly does. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve deeper into these complex and very timely issues. Picking up where we left off, one of the most, I think, thought-provoking things in The Road to Serfdom is how Hayek connects economic control to, control over every other part of life.
It's almost like he's saying that economics isn't just about money, it's about freedom itself.
Yeah, exactly. I think we tend to think about economics as this separate thing,
Numbers and spreadsheets.
Yeah. But Hayek's point is that There's no such thing as a purely economic motive, really. What we call economics is just how people make choices, right, to get the things they want and need.
Using whatever resources they have.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So if a central authority controls all the economic activity, wouldn't that mean they control, well, the means to achieve all our ends?
Not just what we buy, but also what we do, what we create,
Right.
even what we dream of becoming.
That's exactly it. He's saying that when a central authority controls, production, distribution, consumption, they're not just managing an economy. They're managing people's lives.
Wow.
They decide what's valuable, what's worth producing, and ultimately what individuals are even allowed to pursue.
Okay, but some might argue that a truly benevolent planner, they would make sure everyone has their basic needs met.
Right?
Food, shelter, healthcare.
Right. The essentials.
Yeah, isn't that kind of the goal of a planned economy?
That's a common argument.
Yeah.
And it sounds good at first, but it raises this really fundamental question that Hayek makes us face. Who gets to decide what those basic needs even are?
Right.
And what about everything else, the things we want, not just need?
Mm-hmm.
Our aspirations, our dreams, all the different ways we might pursue happiness. Do those get factored into the plan?
This reminds me of how Hayek talks about economic control extending even into our leisure time. That sounds a bit Orwellian.
It does, doesn't it? Like Big Brother dictating our weekends.
Yep.
But that's exactly Hayek's point. He says that in totalitarian countries, even leisure time becomes subject to planning.
Wow.
They have a word for it in German, Freizeitgestaltung, free time shaping.
Free time shaping.
Yeah, it's almost comical how they try to package control as freedom.
So much for free time? It seems like even the most well-intentioned attempts to plan an economy, they run up against this basic conflict, individual choice versus the dictates of the plan.
And that conflict, it becomes really clear when we look at, I think, one of the most fundamental choices we make in life, our work.
Yeah.
Hayek argues that the freedom to choose our occupation, it's even more important for our happiness and well-being than, the freedom to spend our money how we want.
That's interesting. I guess it makes sense when you think about how much of our lives we spend working.
Right.
But wouldn't a planned economy at least try to, match people with jobs based on their skills and talents? Wouldn't that be more efficient?
That's the idea, but Hayek would say it's not that simple. In a planned economy, you have to control what jobs people go into, or what they get paid, or both. Otherwise, the plan just falls apart. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra where each musician can play whatever they want, whenever they want.
You'd get chaos, not a symphony.
Exactly. So individual choice and central planning, they're just fundamentally incompatible, at least when it comes to something as personal and complex as, choosing a career.
So Hayek would say that in a free society, individuals should have the right to pursue their own goals, even if those goals don't fit perfectly into some central plan.
That's right. He sees it as a fundamental human right. And any attempt to restrict that right, well, he thinks it'll lead to a less dynamic society, less creative, less prosperous.
But what about inequality? I mean, people who are born into disadvantaged circumstances, or people who, for whatever reason, lack the skills or opportunities to compete in a free market.
That's a huge concern, and Hayek acknowledges that. He knows that a free market doesn't guarantee equality of outcome. Some people will be more successful than others, and some will struggle. But he argues that this doesn't mean we should just throw out individual liberty and free markets entirely.
So it's about finding that balance between individual freedom and social responsibility.
Right.
But where do we draw the line? How much planning is too much?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And Hayek doesn't give us a simple formula, but he does provide a really powerful way to think about it. We need to be so careful about the kinds of planning we do. And we need to be vigilant, constantly vigilant against that temptation, that allure of security at the expense of freedom.
This reminds me of a really interesting analogy Hayek uses. He contrasts what he calls the commercial type of society with the military type.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one.
It really stuck with me.
It gets to the heart of his concerns about central planning, doesn't it?
Yeah.
He argues that those are the two basic models for social organization. In the commercial type, which he links to a free market, individuals. They bear the responsibility for their choices, and they experience the consequences.
The good and the bad.
Exactly. So they have the freedom to succeed or fail, to innovate, to stagnate, all based on their own decisions.
So it's about agency, taking ownership of your own life.
Yes. And in that military type of society, both choice and risk. They're removed from the individual. They get put in the hands of a central authority.
It's top-down. Everyone has their assigned role.
Right. Obedience, conformity, those are valued above all else.
It's interesting he uses the military because in that context, the structure makes sense.
Of course, yeah.
War, single overriding goal, victory.
Right.
But when you apply that to an entire society...
It gets a bit creepy.
Yeah, like we're all just cogs in a machine.
Marching to the beat of the same drum.
Exactly, and that was Hayek's fear, right?
Yeah, he argued that human society, it's way too complex, too diverse to be managed like an army. We all have different goals, aspirations, different ways of seeing the world.
Trying to force everyone into the same mold, to make them conform to one plan.
It's not only impractical, it's destructive.
So how does this military model actually play out? What are some real-world examples of how that desire for a planned economy, a world without economic risks, how can that actually lead to a loss of choice?
That's where we see these abstract ideas turn into real consequences.
Yeah.
And it often starts with good intentions, that desire to protect people from hardship, uncertainty.
Like social safety nets, unemployment insurance.
Yes, but Hayek makes this important distinction between two types of security.
Okay.
There's security against, severe physical deprivation, which he's for.
Right.
And then security of a particular income or a standard of living, which he argues is just not compatible with a truly free and dynamic society.
So he's not against helping those in need, but he's cautious about trying to guarantee a certain level of economic security for everyone. Why, though? What's so dangerous about that?
He argues that those kinds of guarantees, as well-intentioned as they are, they inevitably lead to restrictions on competition, on individual choice.
Oh, I see.
If you want to guarantee a certain income to a group of workers, for example,
yeah.
You have to prevent others from competing for those jobs, driving wages down.
Right, you create barriers.
You have to.
Yeah.
And that stifles innovation.
Yeah.
It limits opportunities for people outside that protected group.
So it's a kind of artificial stability then.
Yeah.
That benefits some at the expense of others.
Exactly.
And it makes the whole system more fragile, less adaptable.
Hayek would say that by trying to eliminate all risk and uncertainty from the economic realm, we actually create a much more rigid society, more hierarchical, and ultimately more insecure.
So are you saying that any attempt to have a social safety net, any effort to help people facing hardship is doomed to fail?
Not at all. Hayek wasn't some heartless, libertarian. He didn't believe in a dog-eat-dog world. He did believe that a just society should provide a safety net. But he was really wary of creating a system where everyone is guaranteed a certain standard of living no matter what.
So again, it's about finding the right balance.
Right.
Providing a safety net, but not creating a system that discourages people from taking initiative.
Right.
Not undermining the dynamism of the free market.
That's the challenge, and it's a challenge every society has to face. Hayek's work, it doesn't offer easy answers.
Yeah.
But it does give us a framework, a way to think about these things in a clear, nuanced way. And that's why I think the road to serfdom is so relevant, even now, almost a century later.
So if we're trying to avoid this road to serfdom, what should we watch out for? What are the warning signs?
One of the biggest things, I think, is what Hayek called the decline of individualism. He said that one of the first things to go in a planned economy is that spirit of individual initiative, self-reliance.
So it's not just economic freedom, it's a mindset shift.
It is. People become more reliant on the state, less willing to take risks, to chart their own course.
It's almost like he's saying, by prioritizing security over freedom, we risk losing both.
It's a sobering thought.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge, too. Hayek's work is a call to action, It's a reminder that freedom is something you have to fight for, constantly. Defend it against those who would encroach on it, even if they have good intentions.
And this fight, it's not just about changing laws.
Right.
It's about changing hearts and minds.
It is. It's about remembering those values of individual initiative, self-reliance, personal responsibility.
That's where we'll pick up in the last part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
Exploring those solutions, the ways we can resist this drift towards collectivism, reassert the importance of individual liberty.
I'm looking forward to it.
So we've talked about the downsides, right? The dangers of that planned society idea. But is Hayek just saying, hands off, everyone for themselves?
Not really. That's a pretty common misunderstanding. Hayek wasn't arguing for, anarchy. He knew the state has a role, a crucial one even. But it should be limited.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance. Individual freedom, sure, but also a framework that protects people, those who are vulnerable, and helps promote, a just and thriving society.
Okay, so it's not completely unregulated. What does Hayek propose then as an alternative to this, road to serfdom? What's that balanced system look like for him?
He was a big advocate for what he called a competitive order, a system based on rule of law, individual responsibility, and a government that's limited but effective. He really believed in the power of markets to do their thing, allocate resources efficiently, create wealth.
Yeah.
But he also knew there had to be some safeguards to prevent those markets from becoming exploitative or unstable.
So it's not choosing one or the other, the market or the state. It's about both working together. But how? What would that look like?
For Hayek, the state's main job is to set up a fair and transparent system. Legal framework, he calls it. Protect individual rights, make sure contracts are enforced, and that there's no fraud, coercion, things like that. It creates a level playing field where people can pursue their own goals, make agreements with each other without being cheated or exploited.
It's like he's emphasizing trust.
Right.
Predictability in the system.
If people don't trust the rules, if they're scared of being cheated, the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly. And these rules, this framework, it should cover things like money and banking too, right?
Yeah, he saw a really important role for the state there. To keep things stable, prevent those huge booms and busts that can mess people up.
This reminds me of that social market economy idea. Some European countries have adopted that.
There are some parallels, for sure.
Like Germany, Scandinavia.
Yeah. They combine a commitment to free markets with a strong safety net.
So it's possible to have both. A strong economy and a society that takes care of those who need help.
Exactly. And I think that's one of Hayek's most important points. He wants us to think beyond just capitalism versus socialism. There are more nuanced ways to approach things, recognizing that human society is complicated and we need freedom, but also responsibility for each other.
But how do we prevent this balanced system from, backsliding back into that excessive control Hayek warned us about? I mean, how do we resist that temptation to micromanage everything?
That's the tough part, isn't it? I think Hayek would say it takes constant vigilance. We need to deeply understand what makes a free and prosperous society work. We have to be so careful about expanding the role of the state beyond its core functions.
And we have to be willing to defend individual liberty even when it's not popular or easy.
Exactly. It's a call to action, not just for people in government, but for everyone.
To be informed, to be engaged, to speak up for those values. Individual freedom, limited government.
Hayek truly believed that freedom is never a given. You always have to fight for it. And he thought education was the key.
Understanding those dangers of collectivism.
Right. And the principles that make freedom possible in the first place.
So it's not enough to just read The Road to Serfdom or listen to this deep dive.
Right.
It's about taking those ideas and applying them to the world around us.
Challenging the way things are. Questioning those assumptions we often make.
And defending the rights of those who disagree with us, even if we don't like what they have to say. That's what a free society is.
It is. It's that right to disagree, to think differently, to choose your own path.
Hayek's work is a powerful reminder. Freedom is delicate. It needs to be protected.
It does.
Nurtured.
We have to engage with the world around us, think critically, and defend those values that allow a free and prosperous society to exist.
So to our listeners, we'll leave you with Hayek's words. The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. May we all strive to learn from his wisdom and to defend that freedom that allows each of us to live our lives, to make our own choices, to pursue our own unique designs. Until next time, fellow deep divers.